Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents On the Marble Cliffs by Ernst Jünger, translated by Tess Lewis. Introduction by Jessie Jezewska-Stevens. Afterward by Maurice Blanchot. Narrated by Julian Elfer. Introduction 1. Some people live more history than others. Born in Heidelberg in 1895, the German literary giant Ernst Jünger survived a stint in the French Foreign Legion, the rise of the Third Reich, 2 world wars, 14 flesh wounds, the death of his son, executed by the SS, the partition of Germany, and reunification before his death at the remarkable age of 102. Perhaps no historical rupture had a greater influence on his thinking, however, than the rise of industrialized warfare across both world wars. A soldier as much as a writer, Jünger memorably declared in his diaries in 1943 that ancient chivalry is dead. Wars are waged by technicians. Articulating the consequences of this transformation became the central obsession of his work. Jünger's fascination with the ways in which technologically driven projections of power would reshape traditional civilian life and geopolitics have secured his legacy as an unignorable diagnostician of the modern epoch. He is today to industrialized warfare what his contemporaries Walter Benjamin or Siegfried Kracauer were to the rise of mass-produced culture. All three drew connections between technology's assault on the inner life of the individual and fascism's weaponization of the mob. Yet while Kracauer and Benjamin, prominent voices of the Weimar socialist left, denounced fascism from the start, Jünger was very much a man of the right. Though he continues to be widely read, his significant literary achievements can be contemplated only with ambivalence. He remains one of Germany's most celebrated and controversial writers, by far the most interesting to have ever emerged from the interwar right. 2. This book, the most famous of Jünger's novels, was published in Nazi Germany in 1939 and censored by the Gestapo in 1942. It was thanks to Hitler's admiration of Jünger's earlier work that On the Marble Cliffs was published at all. When other party officials pushed for its immediate suppression, he's gone too far, the Führer reportedly replied, "Leave Jünger be." It's not hard to see why the novel attracted the attention of the censors. On the Marble Cliffs charts the slow infiltration and eventual destruction of a sophisticated Elysian society by a barbaric forest tribe whose ruthless leader sows anarchy and terror. Set like all fables in a distant time of its own, the story centers on 2 battle-hardened brothers who've renounced war, politics, and worldly concerns for a monkish existence as botanists. They live apart from the simmering chaos, high up on the Marble Cliffs. The novel was immediately received as an allegory for the rise of the Third Reich, but as Jünger points out in a postscript included here, people understood, even in occupied France, that this shoe fits several feet. In other words, what happened in Germany wasn't historically unique. Echoes were soon to be found in Axis Italy, Vichy France, and the Soviet Union, not to mention in the nascent authoritarianism stirring within Western democracies today. As Jünger saw it, Hitler's nihilism was part of a more general crisis threatening modern civilization. Whatever the politics of the book, and they are nothing if not equivocal, Jünger claimed elsewhere that the novel was above all that. There's no denying its icy polish. The novel is defined by its fantastical Mediterranean landscape, and we spend much of our time admiring the view. To one side of the cliffs lies the Marina with its lush vineyards and islands that float on the blue tides like bright flower petals. To the other, the Campagna, populated by rough but noble cattle herders and bordered by the dark fringe of the forest, where the forces of anarchy lie in wait. There's much to lose. Jeweled lizards, red vipers slithering as if in a single glowing web, astonishing orchids, magical mirrors, abundant vineyards, rarefied libraries. This symbology flickers throughout the novel like reflections on a lake, captivating yet shifting and ultimately eluding fixed interpretation. The imaginary world is at once classical and modern. Perhaps this ancient-seeming realm isn't quite so distant as we thought. There are both automobiles and ballads dedicated to a gluttonous Hercules, shotguns as well as Roman stone. The most striking quality of On the Marble Cliffs is to me its stillness. If fiction is the art of lending time to concepts and truths that seem to exist outside of time, On the Marble Cliffs aims for just the opposite. It is an exercise in draining time, to borrow the phrase the brothers used to describe the study of botany. Until the frenzy of the final battle scene, the book distills itself to a single, suspended moment. The narration hovers over the landscape like a charge in the air. It's the quiet before the storm, or, in our botanist's case, before they fall into the abyss. Throughout his oeuvre, Jünger remained preoccupied with this idea of stopping time. One of the few hopeful symbols to appear in the novel is the mythical mirror of Mauretanians, designed to concentrate sunlight into a magical flame that transforms all it devours into an imperishable state, a process of pure distillation that takes place beyond the reach of either the narrative or the historical durée. One can imagine that Jünger, who after the Second World War experimented with LSD, viewed On the Marble Cliffs as just such a temporal transcendence, a way of preserving those values that Nazism perverted: chivalry, dignity, knowledge, beauty. It is not a protest novel, but, like the mirror of Mauretanians, a kind of security in the void. 3. This framing of On the Marble Cliffs, the author's own, complicates the invitation by Jünger's hagiographers to read it as political critique, thereby exonerating him of his own far-right leanings. I tend to agree with Jünger that On the Marble Cliffs is not merely an allegory for the rise of the Third Reich. In fact, it's difficult to extract a sustained political allegory from any of his works. Jünger's politics were complicated, if not incoherent. A decorated veteran of the First World War, he made his literary debut with a bellicose, best-selling diary from the trenches, Storm of Steel, who was praised by Hitler but who refused to join the Nazi Party, a self-taught conservative intellectual, Jünger never completed university, who won the admiration of Marxist writers like Bertolt Brecht, an incurable elitist sympathetic to communist centralization, he opposed liberalism above all. The Weimar-era Jünger projected an aloof, aestheticizing and ultimately paradoxical strain of fascism. Krakauer captured what feels most damning about Jünger's political thinking during this time in a review of his controversial treatise The Worker, 1932, for the Frankfurter Zeitung, in which he accused Jünger of having metaphysicized, metaphysiziert, politics. What about real, tangible action in our own historical moment? Metaphysics is an escape. These ideological contradictions, or is it political ambivalence, extended throughout the Second World War. The tendency to view the world through the metaphysical lens of cycles of power as opposed to right and left certainly seems to have granted Jünger, then an influential conservative voice, a great deal of moral latitude in distancing himself from the horrors emerging around him. Ever aristocratic, his critiques of Hitler could appear to be as rooted in intellectual snobbery as in moral outrage. He once complained that the Nazis lacked metaphysics. They waged war like technicians. Jünger spent the Second World War as a military censor in Nazi-occupied Paris, where he kept up his ironical circle of acquaintances. His closest companions during this time included the prominent legal scholar Carl Schmitt, a racist and an early supporter of the Nazi Party. Then again, his diaries reveal him to be just as close to the conspirators behind the von Stauffenberg plot on Hitler's life in 1944. Jünger himself was investigated, but no concrete evidence could be found tying him to the attempted assassination. The main conspirators were executed. There is no doubt he considered Hitler a vulgar yet ultimately indomitable monster. The sheer nihilistic scale of the genocide in Nazi concentration and POW camps crystallized his despair, as well as his conviction that more active resistance was pointless. I am overcome by a loathing for the uniforms, the epaulettes, the medals, the weapons, all the glamour I have loved so much, he confessed during a brief tour of the Eastern Front. There's a reason a quip by Jean Cocteau, not exactly exemplary in his own wartime behavior, regarding Jünger's conduct during these years endures. Some people had dirty hands, some people had clean hands, but Jünger had no hands. What did it really mean to be hands-on at such a time, when protest often amounted to nothing more than self-sacrifice? It isn't a question I like to ask. Jünger's son, briefly imprisoned for dissent, was later declared killed in action in Italy, though the 2 bullet holes found at the base of his skull suggested an execution by the SS. The veterans and botanists in On the Marble Cliffs much like Jünger himself, who studied zoology and spent long afternoons in occupied Paris collecting beetles, also delay intervention until it is too late. They are elegists more than dissidents, hunting for rare orchids as the head forester's campaign advances on the classical civilization below. Yet the novel contains enough recognizable allusions to the Third Reich that it no doubt took courage to publish it. A torture hut where the head forester's enemies are flayed is modelled on Hitler's concentration camps for political and social deviants, the first of which were established in 1933. Jünger is likely to have seen prisoners marched past his temporary residence in Lower Saxony. It has been noted that the head forester bears a resemblance to Hermann Göring, the notorious commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and himself an avid hunter. Nazism furthermore valorized forests and their connection to the German romantic spirit. The novel's highs come by way of Jünger's gift for the chilling aphorism. Of the character Brackemardt, modelled on the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, he was of that breed of men who dream concretely, a very dangerous sort. Its lows follow slips into dour, elitist didacticism. When the sense of justice and tradition wanes and when terror clouds the mind, then the strength of the man in the street soon runs dry. This is why noble blood is granted preeminence in all peoples. To my reading, On the Marble Cliffs is a daring but ultimately inward-looking achievement. It is as if Jünger built himself an ivory tower in which to wait out Germany's darkest decades. He never left, nor did he repent. Until his death, Jünger dismissed criticisms of his wartime behaviour. As he aged, he appealed to the growing asymmetry between himself and his younger critics. You weren't there. On the Marble Cliffs serves as a key to the cosmology Jünger developed in these later years. All the major motifs of this novel, serpents, language, nihilism, chivalry, dreams, Spenglerian theories of history as cyclical, return throughout his major wartime and immediate post-war works, most notably the War Diaries and the techno-dystopia of the Glass Bees. In the most generous light, they present an argument for the preservation of beauty, refinement and human dignity in the face of Armageddon. In the harshest, a justification for a retreat into aesthetics and abstraction in the face of all too real atrocities. I recommend reading On the Marble Cliffs at different times of day, with both approaches in mind. Tess Lewis's new translation makes this double reading possible. This edition does the crucial work of reinstating the novel's intended fabular atmosphere, muted in previous iterations and yet so essential for understanding a man who thought in images over concepts and who warned against the enormous dangers of dreaming concretely. The rhythmic prose captures the nostalgia, the suspension, the presentiment of doom. For the first time in English, On the Marble Cliffs lets its eerie, rich redlining show. 4. In Paris, where Jünger often discussed politics with the women who frequented his intellectual circles, he was struck in 1942 by his own observation that women are becoming more intelligent. The line has stuck with me. It recalls the gendered nature of war and the codes of chivalry in which soldiers like Jünger were steeped. It complements his declaration that ancient chivalry, a torch historically carried by men, is dead. It hints in the end at a profound crisis of faith. The pursuits and traditions that Jünger believed gave life its meaning were rendered not only anachronistic, but impotent in the face of pure connoisseurs of power. The murmurs from the wings of 2022 tell us that democracy hasn't been this weak since the Weimar years, and that populism is on the rise. The consensus explanation is that the 20th century's refutation and rectification of pre-existing hierarchies has left many, and above all men, unmoored. These voters, the thinking goes, are newly susceptible to the dark charisma of today's head foresters. A letter to the editor published in Der Spiegel in 1982, written in response to one of Jünger's final public interviews, offers a heedful addendum to this kind of political pathologizing. The author of the letter was a local representative of the Bundesland of Niedersachsen, and the translation is mine. In certain academic circles, it is often discussed to what extent simple-minded workers are made receptive to totalitarian movements. All too often, this discussion overlooks the extent to which these same self-appointed elites distance themselves from basic democratic values. On the Marble Cliffs at once evidences and invites its own critique. An enduring sense of nobility, stripped of a politics, sets its own traps. My fear, these days, is that it's the populace who are becoming more intelligent. Jesse Jezebska Stevens, May 2022. 1. You will know the fierce melancholy that overcomes us at the memory of happy times. How irrevocably these have fled, and we find ourselves separated from them by something even more pitiless than vast distances. In the afterglow, too, these images appear even more enticing. We think of them as we do of a dead lover's body, buried deep in the ground, now appearing before us like a mirage, and we tremble at its greater, more spiritual splendor. Again and again in our parched dreams we grope for every detail, every lineament of the past, and we feel we have not been allotted our full share of life and love, yet no amount of regret can bring back what we have lost. Oh, if only this emotion could serve as a lesson for every moment of happiness we do enjoy. And the memory of our years under sun and moon becomes sweeter still when fear has put an abrupt end to them. Only then do we recognize how fortunate we humans are to live from day to day, in our small communities, under peaceful roofs, engaged in pleasant conversation, and with affectionate greetings morning and night. Alas, we always recognize too late that these simple things offered us a cornucopia of riches. So it is that I, too, look back on the years we lived on the Grand Marina. Only in memory are their charms revealed. To be sure, at the time it seemed that many a problem and care clouded our days, and above all that we needed to be on guard against the head forester. That is why we lived with a certain austerity, and dressed simply, even though bound by no vow. Twice a year, however, we let our garments' rich red lining show, once in spring and once in autumn. In the fall we drank as wise men do, and paid honour to the exquisite wines that thrive on the south-facing slopes of the Grand Marina. When, in the vineyards, we heard the wine-growers' laughing cries amid the scarlet foliage and dark clusters of grapes, when in the small cities and towns the wine-presses began to creak and the smell of fresh pomace drew its heady veil over the farms, we would descend and join the innkeepers, coopers and vintners to drink with them from the rounded jug. There we would always find jovial companions, for the country is a rich and beautiful one, where carefree leisure abounds, and wit and high spirits are the coin of the realm. Thus, evening after evening, we sat down to festive meals. During these weeks, hooded watchers patrolled the vineyards from daybreak to nightfall, armed with rattles and shotguns to keep the gluttonous birds in check. They returned late with garlands of quail, of speckled thrushes and fig-eaters, and their booty soon appeared on the table in bowls adorned with grape leaves. We also enjoyed roast chestnuts and fresh nuts with the new wine, and above all the superb mushrooms they hunt for with dogs in local forests, white truffles, delicate morels, and red Caesar's mushrooms. As long as the wine was honey-coloured and sweet, harmony reigned over the table, and we would sit in peaceful conversation, often with an arm draped over a neighbour's shoulder. But as soon as the wine began to have an effect, releasing its coarser elements, our vital spirits were roused lustily. This gave rise to brilliant duels decided by the weapon of laughter, the jousters distinguishing themselves through the facility and candour with which they wielded ideas, a mastery honed only in a long life of leisure. More than these fleeting hours of sparkling wit, however, we treasured in the depths of intoxication the silent walk home through gardens and fields, even as the morning dew began to form on the ruddy leaves. Leaving the small town through the Cock Gate, we would see the lake shore aglow on our right, while to our left towered the marble cliffs, burnished with moonlight. Between them stretched the vine-covered hills into which the path disappeared. Bound to these walks are memories of a radiant, astonished waking that filled us with both awe and exhilaration. We felt as if we had emerged to the surface of life from its depths. Like a knock that rouses us from sleep, an image would pierce the darkness of our rapture. Perhaps the horn of a goat, such as peasants in these parts mount on tall poles in their gardens. Perhaps an eagle-owl with yellow eyes perched on the roof ridge of a barn, or a meteor speeding and crackling across the firmament. Each and every time we would stop short as if petrified, a sudden shudder running down our spines. Then it seemed we had been granted a new faculty with which to see this land. We looked through eyes endowed with the power to see the gold and crystals in gleaming veins far beneath the glassy earth. And then, grey and shadowy, they would approach us, the ancient indigenous spirits of this land, resident here long before any cloister bells rang or any plough carved a furrow. They hesitantly drew near, their coarse wooden features bearing an inscrutable expression, mingling terror and joy. And we gazed on them, our hearts at once alarmed and deeply moved. At times they seemed to want to speak, but soon they dispersed like smoke. We would cover the short remaining stretch to our rue herb retreat in silence. When the light flared in the library, we would look at each other, and I would see Brother Otto's face shining with sublime radiance. In this mirror I recognized that the encounter had been no illusion. We shook hands without a word, and I climbed to the herbarium. Nor did we ever discuss such experiences at a later date. Upstairs, I would sit for a long time at the window in high spirits, and in my heart I could feel existence itself unspooling its golden threads from the spindle. Then the sun rose over Altiplana and illuminated the lands up to the border of Burgundian territory. The wild escarpments and glaciers sparkled white and red, and the reflection of the high banks trembled in the Marina's glaucous mirror. On the pointed gables, the redstarts now began their day, and fed their second brood, whose hungry chirps sounded like the whetting of knives. Rows of ducks ascended in flight from the lake's reed belt, and in the gardens, finches and goldfinches picked the last grapes from the vines. Then I would hear the library door open as Brother Otto stepped into the garden to check on the lilies. 2. But when spring arrived, we caroused like fools, as is the local custom. We wrapped ourselves in motley garb with fabric patchwork, brightest plumage, and donned stiff, beaked masks. Then, cutting foolish capers and waving our arms like wings, we skipped down to the small town where a tall fool's tree had been erected in the market square. There, in flickering torchlight, the masked procession started out, the men parading as birds, and women costumed in magnificent gowns from olden days. They called out playful taunts, their high voices mimicking the tinkling of music boxes, and we answered them with shrill bird cries. From the taverns and the coopers' workshops, the marches of the feathered guilds beckoned, the goldfinch's thin, piercing warble, the barn owl's whirring titter, the wood grouse's humming double bass, and the squeaky hand organ with which the hoopoe fraternity accompany their scandalous verses. Brother Otto and I joined the black woodpeckers, who beat their marches with cooking spoons on wooden tubs and held council in a fool's court. Here, drinking took skill, for we had to sip our wine from the glass with straws stuck through the nostrils of our beaks. When our heads began to spin, a few turns in the gardens and moats along the town wall refreshed us. We also found out over the dance floors or took off our masks under the pergola of an inn and dined in the company of a fleeting love on escargot à la bourguignon, served in pitted pans. On those nights, the shrill bird cries rang out from every corner until dawn, in dark alleys and along the Grand Marina, throughout the vineyards and chestnut groves, from the gondolas adorned with lanterns floating on the dark expanse of the lake, and even among the cemetery's tall cypresses. And always, like an echo, came startled, fugitive cries in response. The women of this land are beautiful and brimming with that generous vitality old Petadier calls bountiful virtue. As you know, it is not the sorrows of this life, but rather the times of exuberance and wild abundance that bring tears to our eyes when we think back on them. So does, deep in my mind's ear, this play of voices lie, especially that stifled cry with which Loretta met me at the town wall. Although a white, gold-bordered hoop skirt hid her limbs, and a mother-of-pearl mask covered her face, I immediately recognized her in the dark alley by the way her hips swayed with each step, and I slyly hid behind a tree. Then I startled her with my woodpecker laugh and pursued her, flapping my wide black sleeves. On the hillside above, where the Roman stone stands in the vineyards, I caught the exhausted woman and pressed her, trembling, tightly in my arms, my fire-red mask bent over her face. When I felt her limp in my grasp, as if dreaming and spellbound by some enchantment, I took pity on her, and with a smile raised the bird mask to my forehead. Then she too began to smile, and softly put her hand on my lips, so softly that in the silence I heard only the sound of my breath wafting through her fingers. 3. Otherwise, day in, day out, we lived in great seclusion in our rue-herb retreat. This hermitage stood on the edge of the marble cliffs in the middle of one of those islands of rock one sees protruding from the vineyards here and there. The garden was cultivated in narrow beds won from the rock, and along the loose rock walls that edged these beds sprouted an abundance of the wild plants that flourish in fertile vineyard earth. And thus early in the spring blue pearl clusters of the grape hyacinth bloomed, and in the fall we delighted in the winter cherries, their fruits gleaming like red lanterns. But in all seasons the house and garden were bordered by silvery green rue bushes, from which a muddled, swirling scent rose when the sun was high. At midday, when the searing heat cooked the grapes, the hermitage stayed refreshingly cool, for not only were the floors tiled with mosaics in the southern style, but also many of its rooms were recessed deep into the cliff. Still, at this time of day I enjoyed stretching out on the terrace and listening, half asleep, to the cicada's crystalline song. Then swallow-tailed butterflies forayed into the garden and settled on the saucer-shaped flowers of Queen Anne's lace, and the jewelled lizards crawled out onto the sun-warmed rocks of the cliffs. Finally, when the white sand of the serpent's path blazed like a furnace, the lance-head vipers slid slowly onto it, and soon bedecked it like hieroglyphs on a scroll. We had no fear of these creatures, which lived in great numbers in the nooks and crannies around the hermitage. Rather, we were enthralled by their brilliant hues by day, and at night by the soft, sonorous whistles with which they accompanied their amorous play. Often we stepped over them, our robes slightly cinched up, or with our feet nudged them out of the way for horrified visitors. Still, we always held our guests' hands when we walked on the serpent's path, and I often noticed that the sense of freedom and sure-footed confidence that filled us on this track seemed to be imparted to them as well. Many aspects of these creatures combined to make them so familiar to us, yet we would have had but little idea of their behaviour had it not been for our old cook, Lampusa. Every evening, as long as summer lasted, Lampusa set out a little silver bowl of milk at the door of her kitchen, carved into the cliff. Then she lured the vipers with a low call. All over the garden, in the sun's last rays, we saw the golden coils gleam on the black dirt of the lily beds, on the silvery green pillows of rue, and high up in the hazel and elder bushes. Then the creatures clustered around the bowl, forming the sign of the blazing fire-wheel, and accepted the offering. Early on, Lampusa had begun holding young Erio in her arms during this ritual, and he accompanied her call in his high voice. How greatly astonished I was one evening to see the child, who had only just begun to walk, drag the bowl outside. There he beat the rim with a pear-wood spoon, and the red snakes slithered, aglow, from the fissures in the marble cliffs. As if in a waking dream, I heard little Erio laugh as he stood among them on the trodden earth of the kitchen courtyard. The creatures surrounded him, half erect and swaying their heavy triangular heads over his in rapid pendulous swings. I stood on the balcony and did not dare call out to my boy, just as when you see someone sleepwalking on a steep ridge. But then I caught sight of the old woman in the kitchen doorway. Lampusa stood smiling, her arms crossed, and I was overcome with the glorious feeling of security in the midst of mortal danger. From that evening on, it was Erio who summoned us with this vesper bell. When we heard the clink of the silver bowl, we set aside our work to rejoice in the sight of his offering. Brother Otto hurried from his library, and I from the herbarium on the inner gallery. Lampusa, too, left the hearth to listen to the child, her face suffused with pride and tenderness. What amused us most was the zeal with which he kept the animals in order. Soon Erio knew each by name, and he toddled among them in his little gold-trimmed, blue velvet tunic. He took great care to make sure each received its share of milk, and he made room at the bowl for the stragglers. He would tap this or that drinker on the head with his wooden spoon, or, when they did not leave the bowl fast enough, he would grab them just below their heads and yank them away with all his might. However roughly he handled them, the creatures always remained gentle and tame, even when they were molting and particularly sensitive. In this season, the herders do not bring their livestock to the pastures on the marble cliffs, for a well-aimed bite will kill even the strongest bull with lightning speed. Erio loved the largest and most beautiful snake above all the others, the one which Brother Otto and I called the griffin, and which, we inferred from the wine-growers' legends, had lived in the clefts since ancient times. The lance-head viper's body is a metallic red, and often scales of a brassy sheen are scattered throughout the pattern on its back. But the griffin was marked by a flawless...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?